Welcome everybody to this AWS reInvent presentation on how to achieve compliance as code utilizing AWS Config. My name is Itai David Janji. I am the Global Practice Lead here at AWS Cloud Management Tools Partners. Before we get started, I want to give you a bit of context and agenda of what we'll be covering today. First, I will introduce the concept of compliance as code. I'll then talk about how to accelerate the process of achieving compliance as code utilizing AWS Config. In particular, I'll talk about config rules and conformance packs. I'll talk about how our customers utilize the ITSM tools in their customer journey, where ITSM stands for IT Service Management. Afterwards, I'll bring these tools together in a demo, which we have titled Art of Possible. So let's get started. How many of you use AWS Config for configuration management? How many of you use ITSM tools to orchestrate incident and event management or even remediation? How many of you have workloads that require compliance reporting? If you answered yes to any of these questions, today is an opportunity to learn on how we bring those tools together to build a compliance as code framework. So let's get started. Why compliance as code? There are many reasons why we have to treat compliance as a piece of software that is consistently monitored and tested. And some of the reasons include the following. First, compliance increases your operational burden. So as a result of that, it's not just about incidents, it's also about remediation. There is a continuous need to compliance. It's not something you do once and forget about it. It's something that you have to do on day 1 and day 10 and day 20. Compliance varies from one geography to another. So it's important to treat it as a piece of code if you're a global company that operates in multiple geographies. Finally, compliance is a shared responsibility. It's important to pick a cloud provider that allows you to reduce your share of that responsibility. So we ought to treat compliance as a piece of code, as a piece of software that we consistently monitor and also deploy. So how do we get there? Well, the first step is picking up a compliance engine that allows you to consistently monitor configuration changes and compliance drift. For us, it is AWS Config. So let me talk a little bit about AWS Config. AWS Config is our configuration management tool here at AWS. Allows you to store configuration changes for up to 7 years. It integrates with some of your ITSM tools, as I alluded to earlier on, such as ServiceNow and Jira Service Desk, for activities such as CMDB, incident and event management, and remediation. Most importantly, and appropriately for this conversation, it allows you to meet your compliance posture. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's take a look at some of the use cases for AWS Config. As I mentioned, you can use AWS Config for a lot of things. First part is you can use it to integrate with your CMDB in terms of configuration management, where CMDB stands for Configuration Management Database. In addition to that, you can use it for security intelligence. More than that, you can also use it for operational best practices. But more importantly to this discussion, you can use AWS Config to achieve compliance as code utilizing service features such as config rules and conformance packs. So let's deep dive a little closer on what conformance packs and config rules are. So what are config rules and conformance packs? So conformance pack is nothing but a collection of AWS config rules. Essentially, it is the key ingredient to achieving compliance as code. You can deploy conformance pack as a single entity in an immutable way for child accounts. We have conformance packs that accelerate your compliance requirements from operational best practice for some of our services such as S3 or even our security services such as IAM, and of course compliance postures such as PCI and HIPAA. Today, I will demonstrate how you can utilize Conformance Pack for simplicity's sake, or utilize config rules, which can be achieved or used to achieve compliance as code. So let's take a look at how our customers operate today. Our customers use ITSM2, which I mentioned earlier on, stands for IT Service Management Orchestration 2. They use them as a single pane of glass, being able to do things like incident and event management, change management, configuration management. They use them also to orchestrate IT operations among different teams in an engineering organization. As a result, as you think about compliance as code, as you think about the framework, you ought to think about how to meet customers where they are. And in this case, is also integrating with an ITSM2. Today, I'll use an example of an ITSM2 ServiceNow. The lessons that are learned during this presentation can be extended to other ITSM2s such as Zero Service Desk and so forth. So let's take a closer look at how these ITSM2s are currently being used. So this pictorial view really shows the three operational models that our customers sometimes use. On the far left, you see traditional operations, where there is division between developers and also operations teams. As we move to the right, you have Cloud Ops to DevOps, where you build it and you run it. The key important thing to note on this slide is that an ITSM2 is within each and every operational model. It is being used to orchestrate remediation. It is being used to orchestrate activities among different teams. Hence, it's important to include it in your compliance as code framework. So, I want to bring all these tools together before I give you a demo of Out of Possible. You are going to see us utilizing all these three tools together in this demo. First, every compliance as code framework has 4 steps to it. The first step is provisioning, which we'll talk in detail in our demo, utilizing services such as AWS Service Catalog, and utilizing concepts such as infrastructure as code. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 involves having a configuration engine that monitors your compliance drifts and monitors your configuration changes as they occur. In our case, that's AWS Config, which we have reviewed earlier on. The third step is around notification. We will utilize AWS Simple Notification Services, SNS, and we will also utilize our Systems Manager automation document to create a notification in ServiceNow. Finally, it's remediation, as we alluded to earlier on. Remediation will be through EC2 instance APIs and our ITSM2. So with that, I want to take a moment and move you to the demo so we can experience what an Out of Possible compliance as code framework looks like in practice. Hello everybody, welcome to this demo, Out of Possible, achieving compliance as code utilizing AWS Config. My name is Itai David. I am the Global Practice Lead for Cloud Management Tools here at AWS. To get us started, first, I would like to set the context of this demo. In this demo, we'll be covering 4 different distinct steps to building a compliance as code framework. At minimum, every compliance as code framework has 4 distinct steps. The first step starts at provisioning. We will demo the provisioning of an EC2 instance utilizing AWS Service Catalog backed by AWS CloudFormation as part of an infrastructure as code within an ITSM2, where ITSM stands for IT Service Management Orchestration 2. That's step number 1. Step number 2 in building a compliance as code framework is having a continuous engine that monitors your resources. In our case, that is AWS Config. We'll utilize config rules and conformance packs. For simplicity's sake, in this demo, we'll only use one config rule. However, the lessons that are being discussed in this demo can be applied to conformance packs, where conformance packs are nothing but a collection of config rules that can be deployed as a single entity. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 is around notification. We'll show 2 ways to notify and then orchestrate the next step. We'll utilize Amazon Simple Notification Service to notify an ITSM2, or we could also use AWS System Manager to create an incident in our ITSM2, for example, ServiceNow. So that's step number 3. The fourth step is actual remediation. In our case, we will utilize an integration between an ITSM2 and EC2 APIs to remediate this non-compliant EC2 instance. So let us get started. So here I'm in my ITSM orchestration to ServiceNow. Bear in mind, the lessons learned here can be extended to any other orchestration tool that is on the market. So we'll be utilizing AWS Service Catalog to provision an EC2 machine. So let's quickly do that. In our demo today, I am going to call this EC2 machine compliance as code. I am going to choose the demo version. I'm going to insert a fake email. I'm going to add few parameters that are required to create an EC2 machine. So for example, instance type, the environment. I'm going to use a sample key created only for this demo. And then I am going to add my SSH location. That I can only access to. I will add another tag as well. So this is the first part which we alluded to earlier on, which is creating or provisioning using infrastructure as code. The most important thing to remember on this page is everything that we have shown can be modified to meet your particular needs using AWS CloudFormation. So let us go ahead and provision this particular EC2 instance. We are going to follow the request in our orchestration 2. And right now, the configuration item hasn't been created. So we can actually refresh this page. And now this configuration item is being created. Okay, so this is the first step of every compliance as code framework, is creating a resource. It's all about provision. In our case, we're utilizing AWS Service Catalog, being backed by AWS CloudFormation. So while this is in progress, let us navigate to our AWS Console. In our console, as you can see, we have a number of EC2 instances that are currently running, but they're all tests. So I am going to refresh this so that we make sure that the one that we have orchestrated is being created. So as you can see, that is the new instance and it's being initialized. So the first step of a compliance as code framework starts with provisioning. The second step really is around, as we alluded to earlier on, around utilizing a compliance engine that is continuously checking your resources for compliance status. In our case, it is AWS Config. So let's take a look at what that looks like in AWS Config. Right now, as you land on this AWS Config page, you can see that every resource that we have is compliant. It won't be the case once AWS Config picks up that EC2 instance. But two things that I want to point out here. First is Conformance Packs and rules. These are the key service features that we'll be utilizing today. As we mentioned earlier on in this demo, we're only using single rules, but Conformance Packs are a collection of those rules that makes it easier to deploy a single entity compliance package. So let's just take a look at what that would look like if we were to deploy a conformance pack. So we can deploy various conformance packs, for example, PCI conformance pack, and so forth. But again, for this demo, we're only utilizing a single config root for simplicity's sake. Okay, so let's take a look at our rules. These are our rules. And immediately we can see that one rule is now non-compliant. So this is the second step. We have a configuration engine that is consistently monitoring our resources. So what has happened? If we navigate back to ServiceNow, we can see that we have actually created that EC2 instance. You can see the machine has been created and the instance ID is 1141. If we go back to our console and we go back to our EC2 machine console, we should be able to see that instance being created. So there is the instance being created. Those are the last 4 digits. If we go back to config, we can now see that config has actually picked up that one of the resources is non-compliant. So let's take a look at this rule for a minute. If we navigate to this rule, which we'll do today, we can see that this is the same instance ID that was created and is now non-compliant. So what have we done so far? We have covered 2 steps. First, provisioning using infrastructure as code, which is always the first step of a compliance as code framework. Second step is having a configuration engine like AWS Config consistently monitoring your resources when they're created and telling you whether the resource is compliant or non-compliant. In this case, AWS Config has picked up that our resource is non-compliant. So step number 3. Now that we know that this resource is non-compliant, a general rule is to notify. We are going to notify ServiceNow in 2 ways. One, through an SNS topic, simple notification service, and 2, by executing an AWS Systems Manager document to create an incident in ServiceNow. So let's take a look at some of the settings that allows you to do that. If you go to AWS Config, you have an option to create an SNS topic. In this demo, it's already created for you. And this is the topic that the ServiceNow instance will subscribe to. So when there's an alert, it will then create an alert in ServiceNow. The second method of notification is utilizing AWS Systems Manager. In this case, we have an automation doc known as AWS create a ServiceNow incident. And every time this rule is non-compliant, this automation doc will be triggered. So let's double check if we've actually sent a notification to our ServiceNow instance, which is our orchestration tool. In ServiceNow, we can navigate to incidents. Once we navigate to the ServiceNow incident table, we can filter for the incidents that we've just created. So let's do that quickly. We'll filter for created date. Okay, created today. We'll run that. And as you can see, we have created 2 incidents just for demo purposes to show you 2 ways in which you can notify your ServiceNow instance. One is through SSM doc, and the other one is through an SNS alarm. So let's just take a look at one of the incidents to see what's contained in it. As you can see, we have passed the entire JSON that AWS Config sent out when this resource was non-compliant. Again, if you do remember the 4 last digits for the instance ID, it was 1141. Now that we have created an instance, we have completed our step number 3, which is notification to your orchestration tool, where you can then begin the process of remediation. Let us quickly review the first 3 steps that we have performed so far. The first one is we started the compliance as code framework utilizing service catalog, provisioning, and EC2 instance into AWS from an ITSM tool. Step number 2, we utilize a configuration engine like AWS Config to continuously monitor our resources as they are created. And then once they are created, if it's non-compliant, pick that up and then send a notification. Step 3, we send a notification in 2 ways. One, utilizing System Manager Automation Doc, and the second one utilizing Simple Notification Service. At this step, we would like to finally complete a compliance as code framework by remediating that non-compliant EC2 instance. So let's take a look at all the products that we have provisioned. So this is the compliance as code product. Now we know that it's non-compliant based on what AWS Config has picked up, and also on the incidents that we have in our incident table. Now we're going to orchestrate a remediation. There could be multiple ways to remediate a situation like this. You could quarantine the EC2 machine. Possibly, you could also page the owner of that EC2 machine, or you could choose the simplest way, which is to terminate the EC2 machine. So we are going to initiate a termination. As you can now see in our AWS console, the same EC2 machine is terminated, which means that our AWS Config configuration engine should pick up this and make sure that we are now compliant. Once our compliance as code instance has fully terminated, AWS Config should be able to pick it up and update our compliance status. So let's take a look at see what that looks like. If we go back to AWS Config now, you can see that we are fully compliant. And if we look at our EC2 instances, you can also see that that EC2 instance has been terminated, and now we are in compliance. So that ends our demo. Just to quickly wrap up, I want to summarize what we've done and how we can extend this to other scenarios as well. So in summary, this is what we have explored through this art of possible, achieving compliance as code using AWS Config. We started with provisioning, which is usually the first step when you build a compliance as code framework. We provisioned an EC2 instance that was non-compliant with an AWS Config group. The second step is to always have a continuous compliance engine like AWS Config that is consistently monitoring your resources on creation. In our case, we were able to see that the EC2 instance was non-compliant, and then we moved to step number 3, which is notification. In our case, we use an ITSM tool, for example, ServiceNow, but you could potentially extend it to other ITSM tools or orchestration tools. We did that in two ways, one through SMS and the other one by triggering a systems manager document. But the last step of a compliance as code framework always involves remediation. In our case, we remediated by terminating that EC2 instance. Again, this is the art of possible demo, achieving compliance as code utilizing AWS Config. So we're back and we have experienced what an art of possible demo looked like. At this time, I want to bring everything together in a summary. So what have we done today? First, we started about the concept of compliance as code, what it is, why we need it, why we should treat it as a piece of software, as a code that is consistently deployed. We then talked about how we can accelerate that process using AWS Config, in particular config rules and conformance packs. We explored how our customers use ITSM tools, IT service management orchestration tools, to orchestrate remediation and operational capabilities. We brought all these things together in a demo that we have titled Art of Possible. At this point, I want to move us to our ending for this presentation, and I'll start with a few call action items for you to take with you. The first is when you think about compliance as code, I encourage you to think about AWS Config as you talk to your representatives, whether they are account managers, partners, solutions architects, or solutions architects. Second part is consider integration between your ITSM tool and also AWS Config when you build this platform. I want to leave you with 2 action items and 2 blogs that you can go ahead and explore how we build this art of possible demo. Again, my name is Itai David Janji. I'm the Global Practice Lead at AWS. Thank you again for attending this session.